So who is Gary Leon Ridgway? Gary was born February the 18th, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He is the second of 3 sons who was born to Thomas and Mary Ridgway. His father was a bus driver, and his mother worked at JCPenney. One of Ridgway's girlfriends said that Gary always wanted to please his mother, but never could. His second wife, Marcia, said Mary wore the pants in the family, and she was very domineering, according to all the court records. It was said that Mary yelled at her husband constantly, and she was once even saw Mary breaking a dinner plate over her husband's head. A neighbor named Bruce said that he would hear the mother screaming at the boys and their father spanking them. He said, I could sit up in my treehouse and look into their yard. All I'd hear were cries of, "No, Dad, no," as they were getting beaten with a belt or a stick or just whatever. Bruce also said that the boys would get in trouble even if they helped themselves to any food after school. A slice of bread after school was absolutely not allowed. Gary was actually really well liked in school. That Gary never had any trouble getting a girlfriend or getting a date. And Terry Rochelle, who would see Gary at a local Methodist church youth activities, said that Gary was sometimes going to the principal's office, but for nothing bad. However, Gary confessed later to having stabbed a 6-year-old little boy when he was a teenager. The boy survived the attack, but Ridgway told a psychologist that he was interested in stabbing because of his feelings about his mother, and that was according to the Washington Post. I thought about stabbing her in the chest or in the heart, maybe cut her face in the chest, he said. He also said that he had a bedwetting problem until he was 13, and that his mother would wash his genitals after each bedwetting incident. Experts felt that this was a large part of Gary's motivation in becoming a serial killer later in his life. For a child, having your mother wash your genitals, it would also be humiliating, a forensic psychologist of psychiatry said. With humiliation would come rage towards the mother. That is very common in serial murderers. Unconsciously, he is killing his mother over and over again. Gary was dyslexic, and he was held back a year. The Washington Post reports that his IQ was in the low 80s. He was 20 years old when he graduated from Tyee High School in 1969, and that was when he married his high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig, but that marriage was very short-lived. When Ridgway was sent to Vietnam as part of his tour in the U.S. Navy, he contracted gonorrhea from frequently seeing sex workers. And while he was overseas, Craig had an affair, and the marriage ended within a year. Gary's second wife was Marcia Winslow, who he married in 1973. It was during this marriage that Ridgway became a religious fanatic. He would go door to door, and frequently he would cry out during church services. They had one child, a son named Matthew, in 1975. His son told detectives in 2001 that he remembered his father as a very involved parent. Even when I was in 4th grade, when I was with soccer, he'd always, be there for me. I don't think I ever remember him not being there, said Matthew, adding that his dad would try to figure out what Matthew was interested in and try to be a father like you see in the TV shows. Gary and Marcia divorced in 1981, and then in 1988 he married Judith. They lived together in Iowa until 1997. Neighbors described Ridgway as a model neighbor and said that he wanted to talk all the time about tools and gardening tips. Throughout Gary's life in the 1980s and 1990s, he was responsible for at least 49 confirmed murders, which makes him the second most prolific serial killer in U.S. history for confirmed murders after Samuel Little. He confessed to at least 70, but authorities were only able to confirm 48 at the time of his sentencing. A 49th was added later. Investigators think he may be responsible for as many as 90 murders total. His victims were all women who ranged in the age from 15 to 38. And though there were 3 sets of remains found where the ages were not easily determined, they were all most likely in their teens. The nickname, the Green River Killer, came because he dumped most of the victims' bodies in and around the Green River outside of Seattle and Tacoma, Washington. Most of the murders happened in between Ridgway's 2 marriages, with only 3 confirmed victims after Ridgway met Mawson. Later, in 2007, Judith actually told the news channel that she feels that she may have saved lives by being married to Gary. "I feel I've saved lives by being his wife and making him happy," said Judith. She was shocked when he was arrested for these crimes, saying it was like he was 2 different people. "I love the man I knew and hate the man who took him away." Most of the victims were sex workers. Ridgway would lure them into his truck and then rape and strangle them, usually in his home or his truck, and then dump their bodies, sometimes post. Sometimes he would return to the bodies and have intercourse with them. They would get in the car, in the vehicle. I had some of my son's stuff in it. It was like a family setting, Gary said in a prison interview, and he added, "They would see pictures of my son and think I was a normal person. In my mind, I'm saying, kill, kill, kill. I'm going to sweet talk her so I can kill the bitch." In 1982, Gary was arrested on a prostitution charge and became a suspect in the Green River killings, but he passed a polygraph test. However, the members of the Green River Task Force held onto his hair and saliva samples. Nearly 20 years later, in 2001, investigators had enough DNA evidence from the murders to compare it to Ridgway's hair that was still in evidence. The samples matched, and Ridgway was arrested in November of 2001 for the murders of 4 women: Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. Over the course of the trial, and as more evidence was available to be tested, 48 murders were tied to Gary Ridgway. In November of 2003, he confessed to them as part of a plea bargain that would spare him execution in exchange for his cooperation in locating the remains of his victims. Ridgway was later sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of his 48 victims, which added 480 years to his 48-year life sentence. One of the aspects of the case that always baffled investigators was Gary's apparent lack of motive. Gary said, "I just love killing women. I didn't have no morals. Conscience did not stop me. I want to be the best serial killer out there. It was just a killing spree. going for the count. By the time his trial was over, he had been known as the Green River Killer. He had confessed to more killings than any American serial killer before him. And though Ted Bundy was charged with murder in the 70s and sentenced to death, he managed to make one final contribution to society before his execution, when he aided in the capture and arrest of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. See, most of Ridgway's victims were prostitutes or underage runaways. He would pick them up at truck stops and bars along Highway 99 outside of Seattle. He would then rape and strangle them, sometimes by hand and sometimes with things around their throats, before dumping their bodies in wooded areas around the Green River, and that is how he got his nickname. He would also purposely contaminate the crime scene with litter, gum, and cigarette butts, just to throw authorities off. Occasionally, he would dump the body in one place, leave it for a time, and then transport it to another location. At least 2 victims were transported as far away as Portland, Oregon. When the bodies started appearing, the King County Sheriff's Office started up the Green River Task Force, hoping to discover the person responsible. 2 members of the task force were Robert Keppel and Dave Rachert. Robert and Dave periodically interviewed psychologists and criminologists, hoping to gain insight into the motives behind the killer's movements. Eventually, in 1984, their interviews led them to famed serial killer Ted Bundy. Bundy had been in prison for the past 6 years for murder, rape, burglary, and necrophilia, and was at the time awaiting his electrocution, which would come 3 years later. Having deplorable but valuable first-hand experience with the same kinds of killings that had been happening in the Green River area, Bundy proved to be an asset to the case. He became a regular interviewee of the Keppel and Rachert and offered his opinion on the psychology of the killer. During one interview session, Bundy suggested that the killer was most likely revisiting the dump sites to engage in sexual intercourse with the bodies. He advised the investigators that in case they find a fresh grave, stake it out and wait for the killer to return. Bundy's theories turned out to be true, and the police were able to use them to collect samples and provide evidence for an arrest warrant. It took police until 2001 to finally arrest Gary Ridgway. 20 years after committing his crimes, Ridgway was arrested on suspicions of murdering 4 women, and his DNA was later revealed that the same spray paint Ridgway used to work during his crime spree was present at other crime scenes and added those murders to the list of charges. By the time of his trial, Ridgway was facing 49 murder charges and had admitted to 23 others. In exchange for life in prison, instead of the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to provide the locations of remains of all of his victims. After his cooperation, he was sentenced to 49 life sentences to be served consecutively. An additional 10 years was added to each sentence for tampering with evidence, adding 480 years to his 48 life sentences. By the time his trial was over, Gary Ridgway had confessed to more confirmed murders than any other serial killer in American history, claiming that murdering young women was his career, making him the worst serial killer in American history. Ironic that the worst serial killer would be apprehended with the help of one of the most famous ones. Gary said in court, "They were my possession, so I have feelings of only I know where they're at. I know there's 80. Take my word for it. I miss them, and I felt they were taking things, something of mine that I put there." That is what Gary said when the bodies were being recovered. Gary's son, Matthew, really misses his father. He has a very hard time believing any of this. He said they would go on camping trips, play basketball, hang out at the park. He's just one of the guys, you know. He's my dad. He didn't do this. That is what Matthew said while he was describing his first reaction at the shocking news about the police investigation into what his father had done. And Matthew was not the only one to describe Gary as being a very soft-tempered man. Never got upset, never lost his temper, always done for anyone he could. He was always the good guy. Patty Eakes, one of the people that actually got Gary to confess, she said you had to remind yourself of who he was and what he was capable of doing. He would come across as a goofy, middle-aged guy, people pleaser. He loved to have people around him, but yet he was sort of an introvert. He was very polite and well-mannered, although he was a man of few words. He would have no trouble at all initiating in small talk with anyone. Today, Gary is being held at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. And this concludes our bedtime story for tonight. I hope everyone has very sweet dreams. And until next time, good night from Unjustified.